This is Adam Rothberg for Off the Shelf. Our guest in the studio is Daniel Okrent, who I would say is as much a true Renaissance man as anyone in American letters. He's worked in both book and magazine publishing, is a successful writer and editor. His book, Great Fortune, The Epic of Rockefeller Center, was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize. And he's written and edited for Esquire and New England Monthly, was managing editor of Life, and notably served as the first ever public editor of the New York Times. Okrent is also the inventor of rotisserie baseball and has appeared on silver screen in films by Woody Allen and Lasse Hallström and on the little screen in Ken Burns' documentary Baseball. Dan is with us to talk about his newest book, Last Call, The Rise and Fall of Prohibition, published by Scribner. Welcome to Off the Shelf.
Happy to be here. How are you today?
Great, thanks. Now, how did you come to tackle Prohibition as the subject for your book?
Well, as you mentioned, Adam, my last book was a history of Rockefeller Center, and while doing the research for that, I came to learn that the 3 blocks at Rockefeller Center, where it's located, that was the heart of the speakeasy belt in Manhattan in the 1920s. And in doing the research on how the Rockefellers acquired the land rights to build there, I kept on bumping up against these speakeasy owners who had more political power than the Rockefellers did. And I said, that's a subject to chase.
Now, the 18th Amendment, which brought Prohibition to America, was ratified in 1919, but in point of fact, as you write, it was a culmination of many years of temperance advocacy and lobbying. Can you give us a little bit of the prehistory to Prohibition?
Yeah, about 70 or 80 years when people began to agitate for laws that would limit liquor consumption, alcohol consumption. Largely, the primary motive was really the abuse that American women were suffering at the hands of men who were drinking all day long on the frontier and in the cities. There really was an alcohol problem in this country. And then there were others who came in on the movement for other reasons. The suffrage movement, because of the women's rights issue, and also various religious organizations who didn't believe in alcohol. And eventually there were even, the progressives and some members of the Socialist Party who came in on it because they saw that liquor was really something that was hurting the working classes. So it was a broad coalition that got together over the 6 or 7 decades.
Can you talk a little bit more about the relationship between the suffrage movement and the success of the Prohibition movement?
In fact, Susan B. Anthony began her career in public life as a temperance advocate, not as a suffrage advocate. And she was not allowed to give a speech at a meeting of the New York Sons of Temperance, being a daughter of temperance, and that really enraged her. And she hooked up with Elizabeth Cady Stanton and other feminists to begin to agitate for the rights for women to get engaged in political life. And as late in her very late years, in her 70s, toward the end of the 19th century, she made the case directly to the Anti-Saloon League, the primary agents of the Prohibition campaign, said, we'll support you if you'll support us.
Now, I'm glad you brought up the Anti-Saloon League because it seems like now they are the great forgotten driving force behind Prohibition. But as you describe it, they really had a stranglehold on American politics.
I think you can make the case, actually, I think it's an inarguable case, that they were the most powerful organized political movement in American history, which is to say they were the only political movement that specifically sought and achieved a constitutional amendment over many, many years of effort. This is an extraordinary thing. The Constitution, when the 18th Amendment was passed, that was only the second thing in the Constitution that limited the rights of individuals. 2 things. You couldn't own slaves, and you couldn't have access to alcohol. Really something that they were able to pull it off. And it was through many decades of political pressure, very, very carefully and craftily conceived and directed by a forgotten man named Wayne B. Wheeler.
And he really was the man.
Yeah, he was the predecessor, the precursor of everything from Karl Rove to James Carville to really anybody since then who has organized political movements to change the political context of American life. When he died in 1927, the Washington Post said that when the history of our time is written, the first name that people will mention will be that of Wayne B. Wheeler. And of course, within 2 years of repeal, he was totally forgotten.
And he really pioneered tactics that are still being used today, yes?
He in fact invented the term pressure group in a speech at Columbia University in 1922. And what he did is he found minorities that he could put together around an issue that he cared about. He cared about one issue, prohibition. And by finding different minority political organizations, he could build a majority.
So we're seeing those same tactics today play out in the battles over abortion or gun rights.
Yeah, or same-sex marriage. I think that's a very good one, which is to say that not only are a lot of people coalescing around that issue to oppose same-sex marriage, but it's a stand-in issue for many, many other things in American politics. Tell me what you think about same-sex marriage, and I think I can probably tell you what you think about abortion, gun rights, tax policy, and a lot of other things. And the same thing applied during Prohibition. Prohibition stood for a variety of other things. The chief issue was who controlled the country. There was a big issue over immigration at the time, and the white Protestant middle of the country was terrified by and resentful of the cities as they became more and more filled with immigrants.
That's a topic I actually wanted to get to, because it seems like much of the sentiment for or against Prohibition, both before and after passage, was divided along ethnic, religious, or class lines.
It was a very bright line. On one side were the Methodist, Baptists, and other Protestant denominations, in the middle of the country largely, in the South and in the West, very few in the East, that was the heart of the Prohibition movement. On the other side were the Catholics, the Jews, Episcopalians, Lutherans, and you could almost certainly determine how somebody stood on the Prohibition issue by knowing what sort of church or synagogue they attended.
And the manufacturers of beer and alcohol, for the most part, were ethnic.
Yeah, one of the things that really put Prohibition over was World War I, because the brewers they had last names like Busch, Anheuser, Pabst, Schlitz. They were almost all of German origin, and when we entered World War I, fighting the Germans, it made it possible for the Prohibition movement, for Wayne B. Wheeler and others, to demonize the brewers as really working for the Kaiser and against the American war effort. So that, too, was an ethnic division, very clearly.
But it also created some strange combinations of political bedfellows.
Well, you had in one camp, you would have the Ku Klux Klan, which was a dry organization, largely driven by its xenophobia and its anti-Catholic and anti-Jewish feeling. And next to them would be the International Workers of the World, the Industrial Workers of the World, the most radical labor group in America, which also opposed alcohol in American life because they thought it kept the working classes down. Jane Addams of Hull House, Edith Wharton, all in the same place as some political figures you think that they would never even speak to, much less be on the same side of an issue with.
But, as Last Call describes at great length, Prohibition turned out to be anything but dry.
Yeah, it didn't work. It didn't work the way that anybody expected it to work. It is true that alcohol consumption went down substantially, particularly in the beginning. And by the end of Prohibition, we were probably back to about 60 to 70% of the alcohol consumption that characterized America before Prohibition. But it was within a matter of really hours of the amendment coming into effect that the arrests began, the bootlegging began, and people did what they needed to do, had to do, wanted to do to get the liquor that they wanted.
Let's talk about that, because it was also a big boon for business, both legal and illegal.
Yeah, in legal businesses, because there were some exceptions. For instance, sacramental wine was a big exception, and there were winemakers and growers in California particularly who made fortunes by making wine for the church. That was legal under the Volstead Act, the Enforcement Act behind Prohibition. On the illegal side, it was a much better business because there was any bootlegging or the creation of alcohol that could be brought into illegal markets. That was all done without any taxes attached to it. So not only was there an enormous business to be served by providing alcohol for people who wanted it, but the federal government couldn't come anywhere near the money that was being collected.
And what were the rum rows?
Rum Row particularly was this long line of huge ships that were stationed outside the 3-mile and then later the 12-mile limit, mostly from Montauk Point in New York to Cape May in New Jersey, but also they went further south to Virginia Beach, north to Cape Cod, and there were similar installations on the West Coast and the Gulf. These were enormous ships who sat there at anchor and never moved for years because the liquor could be brought to them from the Caribbean, from Europe, from Canada, loaded onto those ships, and they became sort of floating warehouses. And the rum runners ashore, they would come out in their small boats, pick up their 150 cases, and then race back into shore to sell it. You could go to the beach at Coney Island, you could go to the beach at Virginia Beach, and you would look out and you would see these enormous ships just standing there beyond the reach of the Coast Guard or any other enforcement agency.
And a lot of booze was coming over the border from Canada as well, yeah?
It poured over the border from Canada, and there were some enormous fortunes that were made from people who did that. But it came in through the woods, on sleds in northern Maine and New Hampshire and Vermont, and it came in huge rail cars through the tunnel underneath the Detroit River from Windsor, Ontario, into Detroit. That was probably where the faucet was most productive in really pouring liquor into the U.S.
And a huge criminal organization grew up around that.
Well, one of the longest-lasting consequences of Prohibition was the creation of the National transnational crime syndicate. Before then, you ran, if you were in the criminal business, you ran prostitution rings or gambling or even drugs in your own city. But once you had liquor, which had to be moved from one place to another, involving trains and cars and God knows what other means of conveyance, you had to have alliance with other criminals in other cities. So in 1929, there was the famous conference in Atlantic City where the mobsters from 7 or 8 major cities got together, divided up territories, and created the National Syndicate.
Didn't Prohibition also alter the way in which women were able to drink?
You know, before Prohibition, women and men did not drink together, except in very few instances. They drank at home together, perhaps, and wealthy people would drink in hotel restaurants. But the saloon, which was the primary place to serve liquor in American life until Prohibition, was a male-only preserve. Then, when you have the speakeasy come in, the illegality has already created an entirely different atmosphere. Women begin to come. They need to install, the speakeasies need to install bathrooms for women. That's the advent of the word powder room, which was created during Prohibition. That brought in, if you have men and women drinking together, that brought in entertainment. So you had the outlaw culture of jazz joining the outlaw culture of drinking, and it really changed the construction of social life in America.
It glamorized alcohol in a way that it hadn't been before.
That was another thing that I think was undeniable about Prohibition, is that alcohol was a fact of life, and then it became sort of a totem of life during Prohibition. You know, particularly for young people, can you get your hands on it? Can you have a flask? You put that in your hip. High school proms became gathering places for the exchange of liquor and flasks. It really did enable liquor to seep into aspects of American life where it had not been present before.
Now, granted, the book is about Prohibition, but it seems, as you write it, that alcohol and Prohibition completely dominated the political dialogue of the times.
It really did, because, as I said before, it was a stand-in issue. It was a stand-in issue about who was going to control the country, as I said. Was it going to be the new immigrants or the people who had been here already? It was a stand-in issue on the politics of whether the states had more rights than the federal government had rights, about the individual rights. And you could bring so many things into this one conversation that it served as a very convenient gathering place for every American argument.
So what finally pushed the country in the other direction? There
were a number of factors that brought about repeal in 1933, but I think the key factor was the Depression. The stock market crash in 1929 created two needs. One was the need for federal government revenue. Tax revenues plummeted during the Depression, and here was all this liquor and beer being consumed with no tax stamps on it. You know, before Prohibition, it accounted for as much as 40% of domestic revenue came from the excise tax on alcohol. So the government needed that revenue, and Roosevelt, in fact, ran in 1932. One of his platform speeches was, if I can bring back beer alone, that's $250 million to the federal revenue immediately. And then the other factor was a jobs program. Liquor and beer before Prohibition was the 5th largest industry in employment, in terms of employment numbers in America. And bringing back not only the people who worked in the breweries and in the distilleries, but also the drivers, the cork makers, the label makers, the bars, God knows how many other peripheral businesses that came from it. It was an essential to help bring the country out of the Depression.
There seemed to be a couple other things, though, that also moved the country in the other direction. One, it seemed like the dries, as you call them, overreached with something called the Jones Laws.
Yeah, in 1920, the penalties for violating the Volstead Act, the Prohibition Enforcement Law, were really very, very light until 1929. And the Jones Law created mandatory prison sentences, and some sentences as much as 5 or 10 years. And that was really extreme, and there was a very strong reaction against that. And secondarily, there was a general loss of respect for law enforcement, because people saw the law being broken in such wholesale to such a large degree that they began to think that law maybe didn't matter. And that brought a conservative response against Prohibition. People who really believed in law and order but said, if we're not going to enforce this law, we're only ruining all laws by pretending to enforce it.
And that's what drove the alliance of very wealthy and powerful businessmen to...
The repeal movement was paid for by the DuPont family, and they believed in states' rights, and the federal government should stay out of the states' rights. They believed also in individual rights, but they also believed that they shouldn't have to pay so much in taxes. And I have some wonderful letters from one DuPont brother to another DuPont brother that says, if only we can get rid of this damnable Prohibition Amendment, maybe we can get rid of the damnable income tax as well. They wanted to bring back the tax for their own personal purposes as well.
Great. So throughout Last Call, it's pretty clear that you think the entire episode was an act of tremendous hypocrisy and a big waste of resources and a period of almost national insanity. But what's the takeaway for today's citizen?
To me, the most interesting thing about it is that after Prohibition was over, it became harder to get a drink than it was when it was illegal to drink, which is to say that once you had a code of laws and regulations, you can't have a bar, 100 feet from a church or 500 feet from a school. You have to have closing hours. You can't drink on Sundays. You create an apparatus of control, and then it really does get controlled, whereas when there was no apparatus, it was a free-for-all. And I think we see the same thing with drugs today. I'm not making the case for the legalization of drugs, but I do believe that if legalization came, drug use would go down.
Now, as I understand it, you've been working with Ken Burns again, who is also doing a documentary on Prohibition?
That's correct. Ken has got a 6-hour documentary in 3 parts that'll be on public television in 2011. And we work very closely with one another. I'm on the show a great deal, yakking away about what I know about Prohibition. And Ken helped me with my project as well, particularly in finding the photographs, because he had to gather so many of them. It's a very good relation, and I'm really looking forward to that show.
And we are too. Thanks, Daniel, for being on the show.
My pleasure.
Daniel Okrent's Last Call, The Rise and Fall of Prohibition, is published by Scribner. For more information, visit www.simonandschuster.com.